Take notes. So with that, I will turn it over to Joel De La Garza.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me and entertaining me. Any chance I get to come up to Vancouver, I make sure to take it. It's a really excellent city. Interestingly enough, the last time I was here was for the World's Fair, so it's been quite a while. And the city's changed quite a bit. So it's really great to see how it's changed and developed. And I need to make it a point to get up here even more frequently. So I wanted to do a presentation on cyber intelligence. It's kind of become a really hot topic over the last couple of years. I was in a really lucky position at Citigroup to stand up one of the first integrated cyber intelligence centers. This was over a 3-year period where we invested really heavily, tens of millions of dollars, into building a fusion center where we had different kinds of analysts, different kinds of threat intelligence. We were working with different governments around the world, as you can imagine a bank does, and just built a really outstanding program. And the folks that have continued that work after I left have gone on to take it to the next level and really build a fusion center that's something to be pretty proud of. And feel free to Google that. You can read up on it. It's a pretty interesting project that we worked on. One of the byproducts of our investment in cyber intelligence and our focus on cyber intelligence has been that cyber has become sort of a hot commodity, a big buzzword. I know there are several drinking games that you can use where if someone says cyber, you take a shot. We did that for a friend's congressional testimony not too long ago. It's not a good strategy. You can usually not walk after it's done. In general, my response to cyber has been sort of that. That's a t-shirt from the RSA conference in 2014. I think we were all suffering from cyber burnout, which led to the transition to the use of the word threat, right? So now there's 15 companies with threat in their name, all selling some kind of cyber. So that's kind of where I'm approaching this from, sort of as a somewhat jaded, somewhat experienced on the roller coaster of leveraging intelligence to drive your security program, and really how you can kind of leverage that experience to build a best-of-breed program for your company and organization. I meet with a lot of customers. I spend a lot of time in customer meetings, and the number one question I get is, what keeps you up at night, right? That's sort of the question I think most of us get as security professionals. What's the one thing you're the most worried about? I work in Silicon Valley. I work at a very young company. The average age is probably about 25, so I'm on the older end of that. 27? No, I'm just kidding. Wishfully. So we have a very young employee base. It's a very dynamic company. We innovate. We're always trying to do new things, really cool stuff, moving fast, all those sorts of things. And to be honest, my biggest fear and the thing that keeps me up at night is that security will kill that, right? I think having worked in banking, having worked in different parts of a number of different large organizations, I arrived at the conclusion that security is the kind of thing where if you apply it improperly or you over-apply it, you can actually stifle a business and just strangle it to death. And so that's been a real challenge for me working at Box, where we want to have security as part of our story, as part of our go-to-market. We want to have a secure product. We want to be the most secure collaboration platform you can imagine. But at the same time, we want to have a wonderful user experience that's free from friction, that you can access anywhere, all things that, as a security professional, give you heartburn. So that's been a bit of a challenge. And so the way I've kind of conceptualized what I do from a job perspective is that I'm essentially trying to build the world's largest game of bumper bowling, right? So I think everyone hopefully knows what bumper bowling is. Essentially, you have a bowling alley with guardrails so that the ball can't go into the gutter. So my goal is to put up guardrails that keep our employees out of the gutter, but give them the leeway to try to get as many shots and as many strikes as possible, right? So we really want to make sure that people can get stuff done. Actually, that's one of our corporate mottos, is to get stuff done. But we want to make sure that they fail safe, right? So that they can try things, they can be innovative, they can have a lot of velocity in the way that they develop code, but they can never hurt the company. They can never bring it down. They could never cause a customer incident. And ultimately, that means that we have to invest considerably in our cyber intelligence capability. We're not fighting against some mythical creature that's, the creation of some really interesting marketing department somewhere. There are actually adversaries that we're dealing with, and cyber intelligence is really important to understanding those adversaries, how they operate, really demystifying a lot of the stuff that people put out there to try to create fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So what is cyber intel? This is actually a photo we have hanging in our security operations center. It's kind of the average day in the life of an analyst. You're surrounded by fire, but everything is fine. And that's kind of essentially what cyber intelligence means. It means arriving at a point where you start to get visibility into what's happening and you start to understand kind of the troubles that are out there in the world and the things that are coming after you. It does lead you to a condition of essentially feeling at times that everything is on fire. And actually having a rigorous process for managing cyber intelligence is really key to containing that fire to a slow burn. There is a bit of acronym bingo. It's honestly hard for me to follow it. I've tried to steer clear of acronyms in my speech. Grab me afterwards if you want to have a more technical discussion. I won't talk about STIX and TAXI and MISP and all the different kinds of cyber frameworks that are coming out to manage intelligence. But there is a lot of stuff out there. It's happening really, really quickly. And so you need to make sure that you understand sort of the developments before you make any large investments in infrastructure. There's also another key point to cyber intelligence. It's the belief that there is no competitive advantage in security, which is heresy for a lot of companies. It's heresy for us because security is part of our go-to-market strategy. But in reality, security incidents that hit our competitors look badly on us, right? If one of our competitors has an incident, has some kind of a security issue, the whole cloud suffers, which is why we've gone on to fund things like the Cloud Security Alliance to make sure that we raise the level of security for cloud providers so that there's a baseline level of trust across all of them, right? And collaboration and the sharing of cyber intelligence data is incredibly important to making that happen. Now, I was telling someone earlier that I had 2 of my analysts spend a week last week down at Washington at Microsoft's office doing a threat intelligence seminar, a cybercrime summit that they were at. And we were sharing, really sensitive intelligence with 3 of our largest competitors, right? And that's kind of the world we're living in now, where we all have a shared sort of adversary that we're defending against. And keeping that information within the walls of our company is not beneficial to our customers, and it's not beneficial to our industry or the society at large. What you really want to do is get to a point where you're synthesizing this data, where you're taking a lot of information and you're actually using it to guide policy. You're using it to guide investments. You're using it to prioritize your program. And you're making sure that the decisions you make are actually mitigating real-world risks that others are facing. So really briefly, without getting too wonkish, the intelligence lifecycle is something that's been developed for quite some time. The militaries around the world have developed an entire management chain around the way the intelligence lifecycle works. It's about collection, right? So going out there, getting information, collecting it up, processing it into some kind of standardized format, producing an output that your stakeholders can actually ingest, right? You don't want to just send your producers, your production, or your stakeholders a report with a lot of gibberish. You actually want to have actionable conclusions that they can make decisions based on. And then you want to make sure that you distribute it to those stakeholders. So having a form or a mechanism where you're routinely sharing this information with those stakeholders, collecting requirements from them, so you could deliver a report and they could say, this is great, I would love to know what my options are, provide me with more information around this specific group or threat actor, and then folding that back into your collection. The idea being that you build this entirely contained intelligence lifecycle around the way that you manage your information. What intelligence isn't? It's not a fire hose, right? It's not the ingestion of data. You don't want to get into a place where you're investing and trying to collect up as much data into a database as possible. If you start out from the position of, I need to ingest all these feeds, I need to get all this data into my system, and then somehow I'll make sense of it, you're probably going to fail, right? So you need to start from the perspective that you're not there to grab as much data as you can. You actually have to do both quantitative and qualitative analysis of the data that you're taking in. Intelligence isn't deterministic. Oftentimes the information you get on the way threat actors are operating isn't going to give you enough information to make hard decisions, right? It's going to inform the decisions you're making, but it won't be deterministic in the right course that you should take. It's not a fire hose. Obviously, you don't want to ingest a tremendous amount of data so that you overwhelm yourself. It isn't timeless, and it certainly isn't easy. It takes a pretty tremendous investment and dedicated resources to processing this stuff out, or using third parties that are also intelligence providers as well. So I wanted to give a brief history of kind of how we got to this point. I've been doing this for a number of years, living specifically in the incident response and forensics world for a number of years, and have worked in kind of a number of different intelligence roles. Slim pickings from Dr. Strangelove writing The Nuclear Bomb to Destruction. That's kind of how this all started, right? I think there's a number of great books by Cheswick and Belovin, Finding the Wily Hacker, where they track Burford. There's The Cuckoo's Egg, which is about tracking another hacker, and then there's the series of books written about Kevin Mitnick. There's just a really great wealth of knowledge about the early days of this profession, where a lot of people who are researchers at universities, they might have been physics professors, they might have been computer science professors, had their personal computers hacked. They then chased these guys down, did their own forensics investigations and hunted them down. And so in the beginning, intelligence was largely a function of your incident response team. So there were a couple of well-established teams. First.org was probably one of the first commercial or public organizations to bring them together. And it started with about 15 teams, most of the large universities, a couple large tech companies. And they met once a quarter and then once a year. So it wasn't a very frequent collaboration. Typically what you had was people playing phone tag or phone games. So you'd call your friend at a different university saying, I've seen this. They'd call someone at a large technology company saying they had seen it. And essentially you'd do this kind of round robin through the intelligence sharing system. There was very little federal interest at this point. It was mostly commercial space and education, not-for-profits that were on their own. Coming up after that, intelligence actually became its own function. This was starting towards the end of the 90s, the early 2000s. What we had is the proliferation of trust communities. I know most of you, if you're as security professionals, you're probably in at least one trust community. There are a proliferation of them now. I know I'm one of the folks on my team, I think, is in 15 different trust communities. So we've had this kind of intelligence as a career path, intelligence as a job description. You started, 6 or 7 years ago seeing postings for jobs for intelligence analysts for commercial organizations. And you saw the establishment of standards. So STIX, TAXI, a couple of the other frameworks started to get released. This is all kind of intelligence becoming its own standalone discipline, much like incident response or security architecture and engineering. The initial efforts that these teams were doing was focusing on things like botnet takedowns. So Microsoft did a really excellent job bringing down a number of very large, sophisticated botnet operations. Financial services were doing that as well. You could see very large, coordinated, multi-sector efforts to bring down bad guys and bring them to justice. Essentially what this led to was what we would call the fiefdom of doom, right? So you had all these really, really smart people that understood the risk landscape, knew how everything was hacked, knew about BIOS firmware and malware hacking, absolutely terrified of everything and anything, living in one room, compartmentalized, sharing out only specific bits of information, and essentially becoming kind of a downward spiral, right? There's nothing worse in the world than knowing a train wreck is going to happen and being forced to watch it. And that's essentially what that first version of the cyber intelligence kind of program was. Moving forward to today, what we're trying to implement, which is getting a lot of traction, which is this idea of DevOps for security, right? And so this is the idea that you break down walls. And I'll really talk briefly about what DevOps is. It's becoming a bit of a fad at the moment. So in the beginning, as a software development house, software companies were working on a waterfall schedule. So they had a table of releases. They were releasing code quarterly. They were doing major version upgrades every year. And that was called waterfall development. A couple of years ago, people started to transition to what's called agile development. Agile is where you're making a lot more small incremental changes. Rather than going to market with a fully baked product that encompasses all of the features and enhancements you'd like to release, you instead go to market with a minimum viable product. And then you use the market and your feedback from customers to make adjustments to your product and add the features that they think is the most value. You also move from a quarterly, weekly, or yearly release schedule to a daily release schedule. So you start to move very quickly. You start to implement changes very quickly. And you instrument your environment in such a way that you can canary, test, and roll back changes in the event that you find problems or issues. It's very focused on a lot of automation. There's not a whole lot of manual processing that happens in that model. And over time, what's happened with DevOps is that we're starting to move, with Agile rather, is we're moving into something which is DevOps, which means developer and operations. We went through a whole phase for the last 15 years of segmenting out developers, getting them out of the production environment, making sure that we had segregation of duties. We've gotten to a point now with containerization, with scheduling and automation, where we can have developers release code into production through an automated supply chain using containers. That means that they can release their code, push their changes without having to actually log into servers, implement the code, make changes to the servers. Think of a highly compartmentalized, highly automated system for scheduling and execution of content. And so one of the things that folks have been driving is this idea that we need to get that way with more of our disciplines. And so at Box, one of the things that we've started to do is to combine a lot of our different organizations. It's modeled on the Joint Terrorism Task Force. That was a big event that happened after 9/11. The government essentially looked after 9/11 and some of the reports at how intelligence had been acted on during and prior to the 9/11 attacks in America. One of the things they realized was that there were a number of different fiefdoms across a number of different agencies that were all sitting on pieces of relevant information. The Joint Terrorism Task Force was an attempt to bring all these agencies together and have them start to collaborate more closely, to share that information, to synthesize a better product, and to get that to the decision makers to make ideas based on how they should operate. Essentially, this is the first implementation of what we would call DevOps at scale, although the US federal government folks would probably kick me for saying that. The idea behind this was that there was one team, one mission, right? There isn't a fiefdom, there isn't a column, there aren't different job descriptions, it's one team, it's one mission. Essentially aligning a number of different organizations focused on one product, which was producing intelligence for terrorism policy and procedures. The next thing they did was they physically sat folks together. So, typically in a lot of these organizations, everyone had their own offices, they had their own, operation centers. They moved away from that model and started to put a cross-pollinated fusion center together where different people with different backgrounds sat together. It was a tremendous success. There were a lot of success stories, and there's a bunch of movies out there you can watch. There were also some really high-profile failures. I won't go into those, but you can Google it and see. I think we all have kind of been on that road. So that said, at Box, what we're trying to do is come as close to combining security and operations as possible. So we have a joint operations center. We have our folks that are watching our site, operating our site 24/7. Rather than building a security operations center, so the big panel walls and the really fancy displays, and putting our security people in a dedicated room, we decided to sit our security people on rotating shifts with our other operations folks. What we found was a couple really interesting things. It put an end to over the fence, right? It was no longer an issue of, hey, we saw a suspicious login to this server, let's throw it over to the systems administrators and have them chase it down. When you have these guys sitting in the same room together, they'll go hunt it down together, right? The collaboration is there, and there's a lot more guidance and a lot more one-on-one time that's happening in that regard. We also noticed that security people are generally really bad at operations. I've built a number of SOCs. I've worked in a number of continuous operation roles for security teams. We don't do continuous operations as well as operations folks do continuous operations. Any good operations team can give you SLA metrics down to 5 or 6, 9, right? They can tell you that they've had 99.9995 or 99.997. I've yet to see a security team that's that rigorous in the way that they manage their SLAs and the way they manage their operations. So when you start to put security people with a bunch of operations people that are that disciplined, they internalize that discipline and start to understand that maybe we should be managing SLAs for security much in the same way that our operations folks manage SLAs for operations. And then finally, most operations people are actually pretty bad at security, right? And that's where a lot of our security problems come from. So when you sit a security person inside of an operations center, that security mindfulness and that security awareness starts to rub off on those operations people. And with this cross-pollination, one of the interesting things that's happened is we've actually started to have people moving in between organizations. So recently, a threat analyst joined our team who was formerly a database administrator. We have network operations people that want to move into security analyst roles. It's becoming a real cross-pollination where security is no longer kind of this silo that exists independent of everyone in some kind of ivory tower. So the next thing that we started to do was really drive our program with our intelligence. So we have a number of vendors that we use. We have a number of organizations that we share with, trust communities. We really wanted to take our intel, and rather than investing in things that policy says we should do or different kinds of security standards say that we should do, we wanted to use the actual threat intelligence to make our security program better, right? To drive continuous improvement. So on a quarterly basis, we run red team, blue team exercises using scenarios that we pull from our threat intelligence. So for example, we know that company X was breached by doing these sets of things. Let's run those sets of things through our environment. Let's test them out. Let's really push those hypotheses and see if they work in our environment, right? And we go through a process where we have a number of different exercises we execute as part of that red team, blue team exercise that generate our work slate for the quarter. So we do this on a quarterly basis. We're continually reassessing our security roadmap and adjusting our security strategy based on how we see failing using our cyber intel. We use live fire penetration tests. I know that's terrifying. There are ways to make it safe, and I'm more than happy to share those afterward. But it's been really beneficial for us to sort of use live fire penetration tests to actually try to, infiltrate our infrastructure to see where our controls fall down. It's one thing to theoretically say that, oh, there's an unpatched server here and a hacker could potentially exploit it. It's another to actually exploit the server. Show that to your leadership, to show that to folks, on the operations teams to help them drive to correct it. We also do, the other thing that we've been doing that's been our greatest success, to be quite honest, is that we provide weekly security updates to everyone in the company, or as many people as we can tell about it. So our incident data, spear phishing attacks, any kind of malware that we have, we send out a security weekly summary at the end of every week to all of our developers, all of our operations folks, and key technical product people, as well as our e-staff, that inform them of the attacks that are happening to Box on a weekly basis. This keeps it forefront in their mind. We also provide them with examples of the spear phishing emails that come in. We have a spearfish email of the week, and we make sure to really engage our users in understanding that security starts with them. And then finally, after the last bullet point here is something I would have laughed at myself for saying probably 3 years ago. I was always of the opinion that it wasn't about training, it isn't about awareness. Actually, what you needed to do was buy technology, have these stacks, build these massive control infrastructures, and that you could essentially solve hacking or computer intrusions with technology. 3 years of working at Box and trying something different, I can tell you that education and training is the best investment you can make from a security perspective. There isn't a security product that we don't run in our environment or haven't run in our environment. We run them in parallel. We have a really interesting security stack that we've built. So we have a bunch of Arista switches hanging off of taps all over our environment. We can put in as many as 42 security solutions on any one of our network monitoring points at any moment, run them concurrently. We aggregate all that data into a big Hadoop cluster. We do really sophisticated analytics on a lot of the events that are happening. We also do quality of service on all of our sensors. So we know exactly what's catching what. We know their efficacy. And I can tell you that, generally speaking, most of your security products catch 40 to 50% of the things that are out there. And they're all catching a different 40 to 50%. It's very rare that you have full overlap with stuff. So there's, a constellation of about 60% of things that are going to get through the controls that you've already implemented. And there's a massive industry built around continually developing more things to get through your controls. It'd be somewhat naive to assume that the bad guys don't also have these tools, right? They have a whole testing process for their malware. They have a whole testing process for the things that they're launching. And they're going to be testing them on the infrastructures that you run. And so with that in mind, training and awareness has been key to us catching most of our sophisticated attacks, full stop. We've seen numerous attacks where you've had inbound spear phishing attempts using zero-day exploits as PDF or JavaScript type attacks on our users, where the users have forwarded the email to the security team and none of our detective controls have worked. And that includes all of our email filtering, inbound scanning, our APT detection appliances, our intelligent firewalls. This is the way the world is right now. And so training and awareness is your single biggest investment, best investment and return on investment from a security perspective. One of the things that we're working to do, and this is a little bit product-y, and I'm trying not to be too much of a shill, but one of the things that we're trying to do is to automate cyber intelligence as much as possible. We just released, I think about 6 months ago, we released our enterprise key management solution. So our enterprise key management solution gives our customers the ability to encrypt their data in Box with their own encryption key, right? So we don't control the key, you control the key. If you have to access the data, it has to go to your key server. The decryption happens there. It's fully independent of us. So essentially, we've implemented bring your own key, right? It's generally how it's being referred to. The next thing we're working to do is to bring your own cyber intelligence, right? So we have a lot of customers that are very large. GE is the perfect example of that. They have their own cyber intelligence program. They have, tons of analysts, tons of people that are working on finding new threats. What we've looked to do is to give them the ability to ingest that information in a structured format so that they can make sure that Box isn't being accessed by any one of their known indicators, right? And then we can start to write policies over, a lot of the activity that's happening. So for example, if you're coming from a Tor IP address, you can't authenticate into our infrastructure. You can't download content, you can't upload content, you're essentially dead to us. If you're coming from a pool of IP addresses in an address space that we believe to be somewhat risky, we can allow you to preview data, but we're going to watermark it. We're not going to allow you to edit it. You can't download it. You can't upload it. Really getting to the point where we can start to tie a lot of this intelligence into risk-based decisions, which then determine how your data gets accessed. And these are just an example of some of the different products we're using. I mean, there's a number of other products out there. If you go to box.com/trust, you can see our trust ecosystem, which are all the companies that we've partnered with. Essentially, those are a pretty good indication of all the tools that we also use internally. So what's the worst that can happen? You've invested heavily. I know. Sorry. Now time for a light note. Just so you guys know, I'm putting my forecasting intelligence hat on. If that man wins president of the U.S., the next refugee crisis you're going to face will be Americans. So, thank you. Yeah. So you know, please don't build a wall. Keep him out. Oddly enough, my hotel's across the street from his new hotel here, so it's interesting waking up to seeing that every day, and you're like, oh, great. So let's say you invested in cyber intelligence. You've got a program. You're getting a lot of information. You're really engaged with the community. You're sharing. You have some level of maturity on what's happening. So what are the worst things that can happen? Because I can guarantee you that this is going to be a bumpy ride, and by all means, I've made a number of pretty huge mistakes. The first thing to realize is that your intelligence is someone else's meal, right? There are going to be at least one security vendor out there, maybe more, that's probably chasing the same thread that you've just pulled, right? And their goal is not going to be to like help you out and give you information. Their goal is going to be to write a white paper about how this really sophisticated state-sponsored group just stole all your data. And so you always have to remember and be very careful when you're collaborating with people. This is where personal relationships become very important. The cases you're working on, the intel you're working on, could be used by someone to potentially embarrass you or your firm, right? And so that's something that happens way more than I'd like to admit. I know there's been a couple pretty high-profile cases of it happening. This is where trust communities and personal relationships become really important. You also have to remember that there are a number of governments around the world that are really interested in getting this information as well, right? A zero-day exploit that you find would be of interest to your government, to our government, to just about every government in the world, right? That's a $1 million investment right there at least. And so you have to be very careful around the way that you handle this. You need to have specific handling standards for your intel. At Box, we use the TLP, the traffic light protocol. It's really simple: red, yellow, green. Green data can be shared widely. Yellow data can be shared with trusted sources. Red data can't be shared unless explicitly authorized. And so we use that to kind of flag a lot of our intel to make sure that stuff that could potentially be problematic or radioactive doesn't get out there. So the dark side. There is certainly a dark side to this industry. You know, there have been a lot of problems. You can Google about them in the press. Security companies, and none of the security companies represented here. In fact, I would imagine most of the security companies that you work with will never do anything unethical. But there are a lot of very small security companies that will, right? And there have been a couple cases recently that were prosecuted where small security companies were essentially extorting customers using cyber intelligence, right? You'd get a visit from a sales guy who'd basically say, hey, we know you have a problem. We know you've been breached. We found some of your data, and it's going to cost you $200,000 for us to give you the information and forget about it. There were a couple of indictments in America of people that were doing this because essentially that's extortion. So you always have to be on the lookout about those things. You always have to be very cognizant of that fact. The other issue that might happen as you start to collaborate and share out indicators is that your customers might think that you've been breached, or they might infer from the information that you're sharing that you have a pretty significant or substantial problem. Many years ago at a firm I won't name, we had an employee, a high-level employee, senior executives employee. His wife's travel website had been breached by a really sophisticated, probably Western intelligence agency, and was being used to distribute a pretty nasty bit of malware. You know, we were obviously interested in this just academically, but what we decided to do was to provide some analysts to go take a look at this thing, to do a report, to pull apart the malware, to understand kind of the C2s, and then we shared it out to the community. So we with our trusted partners, with a lot of our buddies, we shared out a report that was basically, hey, we found this thing, these are the indicators, you probably want to check for them. And we even put in there a disclaimer that like this was not in any way affiliated with our organization, this was just us being good Samaritans. You know, 2 days later, the New York Times, Matt Richtel from the New York Times was calling us, asking us about our breach by a Western intelligence agency. And he'd, you know, gotten his hands on the report that we sent out, immediately inferred that it was a breach of our organization, and was about to go to press with a really damning story of how our security infrastructure had failed. So you have to be really careful with the way that you share some of this information. If it doesn't come from you, if it's from a third party, some people may infer, if it gets out, that you've had a problem that you didn't. The next issue is that you could overshare and break perhaps contractual or legal agreements that you might have with your customers or with the countries in which you operate. So it's always really important that you work very closely with your general counsel and have a lawyer that understands the way that sharing and collaboration works. At Box, we've restructured the way that security and compliance sit, and now we report to our general counsel. So we are part of the legal team, we're part of that organization. We roll into the CFO as part of our risk control function, and we also provide reporting out to the board. But having that tie into legal and understanding what your legal liabilities are and what your potential pitfalls are around this is incredibly important. And then finally, when you start to collaborate out, you can find yourself in law enforcement conundrums. So you may share a piece of intelligence or a piece of information that's linked to an active law enforcement investigation. You may end up getting a subpoena. You may become part of that investigation. There's always a risk that somehow you'll be pulled in that way. And then once you get caught up into that process, you get forced into sort of the road of disclosure and how that whole works around that process. So it's also something to be very, very mindful of and to make sure that you're working with your legal partners as well. Silicon Valley, the TV show on HBO, it's hilarious. I suggest you all watch it if you haven't. It's great. But the point being is that our industry is being disrupted in a really, really profound way. There's a lot of disruption that's happening now. You're seeing legacy vendors in the IT space kind of get demolished by the cloud. A lot of the established players in the information technology business are seeing the revenues decline quarter over quarter for sometimes 15 to 16 quarters in a row now. That's cloud disrupting that business as customers start to transition from on-prem to cloud. The same thing is happening in the security space, right? So I have a 45-person roughly security team at Box. Google's got a couple hundred people on security. LinkedIn has a couple hundred people. You've got really large companies with hundreds of people focusing on information security. The folks that we have on our team have an engineering background. They can code. They're writing a lot of our own tooling, right? A lot of the tools that we use on a day-to-day basis are developed in-house. We open source them, we share them. There's a couple of really interesting projects out there that you can look up where we collaborate out on this information. That really kind of takes a lot of the products that you need off the table, right? From a network forensics perspective, when I started at Box, we were using a commercially provided network forensics platform to do all of our analysis. We moved to Moloch, which is an open source tool. It's free. All you have to do is pay for hardware and have an engineer that can operate it. Obviously, there are trade-offs between build versus buy, but the build side of it, there's so much stuff out there now that building it's becoming a lot cheaper, right? And that's kind of what's facing the security industry from a disruption perspective. Trust communities, there are so many well-funded trust communities. There are also ISACs in America, which are information sharing and analysis centers, where you can get a lot of this information, a lot of the signatures, a lot of the indicators, IP addresses, user agents. A lot of that stuff's available for free. It's just about getting plugged into those communities and making sure that you can ingest and use that information. And then finally, I think the most important thing to me as a security professional is actually, and I kind of hate saying this because it's kind of true but also somewhat painful, security is a feature. It's not a product, right? And the idea that there is this thing you can buy that is security is just kind of erroneous in and of itself, right? Security should be a feature of the things that you use. You don't go to the airport and pay an additional fee so that you can be secure, right? You just have an expectation in public places that security will exist and be a feature of whatever it is you're consuming. You don't buy a car and pay extra for the security feature or the safety feature, right? It should be something that's part as a baseline of every service that you purchase. So as we see the proliferation of cloud and the rollout of cloud services to large organizations, we're moving into a world where security will be provided as part of a feature of that service that you're buying. Amazon AWS is a really good example of that. They provide a lot of security as features as part of their core product offerings. At Box, we do that as well, right? We do that with encryption, we do that with two-factor authorization, we do that with logging and reporting, and we do that with virus scanning, right? These are all just features that are part of our core product. And then we have additional features that you can add to that underlying core product. And so that's driving a lot of disruption in the security space. Even though if you look at the VC funding, it doesn't seem like it's slowing down. The reality is that at every level, security is just being disrupted. And so it's really important that we pay attention to that. Last but not least, second to last, so the most terrifying words in the English language is "I'm from the government, I'm here to help." This is a famous Ronald Reagan talk when he was going on his anti-government rants. One of the interesting things about what's happening, at least in the U.S., is that they've passed CISA, which is an information sharing law in the United States, which basically is looking to protect private companies who wish to share with the government and vice versa, so that the government can share with private companies. What they want to do is to try to create protections for intelligence sharing. It's really new. I haven't had a whole lot of time to get into the instrumentation of that. We've been working a lot with the Department of Justice to understand what exactly this means. But this is trying to take a lot of the ambiguity out of the cyber intelligence component. So when I said earlier about law enforcement getting involved, oh, liability is being created. Oh, that's not me. Anyway, it's got issues, and so we are in the process of trying to understand what those issues are. Last but not least, the law of diminishing returns, right? So I encourage you all to understand what the law of diminishing returns means. Essentially, it means that if you're producing something and you hold all parts of that production the same, but you increase one input, over time, the amount that you'll get out of that system will flatline and start to go down, right? You have diminishing returns as you add additional things. Oh, thank you. So it's really important to understand as you stand up an intelligence capability that just getting more data isn't going to necessarily get you more value, right? And at some point, you don't necessarily find the needle by adding more hay. And so you have to be very careful in the way that you increase your inputs into your intelligence process. And you have to kind of understand the way your threat actors are operating and changing. I think in closing, I think the ISIS-Al-Qaeda distinction is really important to get back to the terrorism stuff. Al-Qaeda was very much a cell-based organization, top-down command and control. A lot of the tools that were developed to catch those guys was based on link analysis. So you would look at one person, you would link them to another person, which would link them to that person, and essentially you could walk your way up that chain. They operated as a paramilitary organization. They had missions and soldiers and training and all those sorts of things. ISIS is different, right? And I was lucky enough to spend some time with some folks who were focusing on ISIS. ISIS operates completely different, right? The core model of ISIS is bottom up, right? They produce a lot of slick videos. They put them on YouTube. They put them on Facebook. They're on Twitter. They're actively trying to win hearts and minds. Think of them more like a marketing organization than a paramilitary organization. And ISIS's ultimate goal is to radicalize, to have people self-radicalize as quickly as possible, right? Their goal isn't to actually get them, in some cases it is, it's a little bit tough to discern, but what they would like to have is to have those lone wolf attacks, right? The person that feels alienated in some country watches these YouTube videos, reads the paraphernalia, and then decides to go on and take on a mission on their own without having any kind of interaction other than watching these videos and reading these pamphlets with ISIS. And so that's a radically different threat that we're facing, right? And I think that it requires radically new tools, and you know, the intelligence community is certainly wrapping their brains around this. There have been a number of different meetings, but I think it's really key for us as security professionals to understand how these tactics are changing. So thank you. That's my speech. More than happy to take any questions. I don't know if we have any time at the moment. Cool. Any questions? I got jokes and jokes.
Well, that's one question. I fully expect to deny that NSA is your system.
Uh-huh.
So, feel free, I'm not going to comment
Sure.
on that. But when it comes to strictly pinning or just allowing you from client endpoint to your services, do you guys plan to implement that?
Yeah, so we do have, okay, so that's a long discussion. So 2.5 years ago, we did have certificate pinning. So it was always a core part of our product. We started to move into enterprises that were using security tools that wanted to do man in the middle of their traffic. So most of your large corporations do deep packet inspection. They're doing it either with firewalls or with proxies. We had to remove certificate pinning for those large enterprises, and so that they could implement their deep packet inspection and their content inspection. We have a new version of the mobile client and of our desktop client that will be coming out at some point in the future that will implement certificate pinning. What we're going to do is actually implement it in a way that our customers can configure so that they could actually, deploy certificates, use certificate and endpoints. In the interim, what we've done is we released our governance package, which gives you the ability to do endpoint posture checking so that you could actually set a certificate on your machine and use that as a validator to get access into that infrastructure. So that's how we do it. And then with regard to the NSA discussion, I mean, one of my there was a talk I saw a while ago where someone was saying, we were talking about the Mossad, right? Because the Mossad is like the little NSA, incredibly effective intelligence organization, one of the best in the world. And someone was saying, oh, well, if the Mossad's coming after you, you're probably already dead, right? But that's beside the point. But yeah, the NSA stuff has certainly been an interesting discussion. But you know, that's why we were giving customers the ability to bring their own encryption key, right? It's about transparency and openness and giving customers the power to make those decisions for themselves. Yeah. Cool. Cool. Any other questions? Great. Thank you.
So we'll be downstairs. If you have any other questions, we have a team. Very much.
Thank you very much.